Great. Good morning, everyone. My name is Trinh Nguyen. I'm the Director of the Mayor's Office of Workforce Development. Thank you for taking the time from your busy schedule to attend our panel, The Future of Work, as it explores the impact of remote work, focusing on questions that I know most of you have. How will the remote environment change the workforce? And this panel brings together researchers and workforce development practitioners to look at the impacts on the labor market, workforce training, and workers themselves. And it is a timely topic that we live in now because the Massachusetts Business Roundtable will be releasing its findings from the survey about 50 large corporate members that is conducted by McKinsey & Company. And in it, one of its findings is that pre-pandemic, 90% of employers surveys expected their workers in the office about 5 days a week, and only 10% to do hybrid. Post-pandemic, those numbers are flipped. They're expected that 80% of the employers responded will embrace a hybrid approach, and only about 20% of employers said they'll return to 5 days a week in the office. There are similar employers surveys conducted, and I know that many of you as workforce trainers and practitioners are asking these important questions as we move towards economic recovery. And to take a dive deeper, the more relevant questions are what types of jobs are working remotely, how is it being used, and what competencies are needed for workers as they are coming back into the labor force, and how are customers being served as employees are being trained. Our panel of experts will shed some light on this. This morning, we're joined by Matthew Resseger, Senior Economist at the Boston Planning and Development Agency, also by Sarah Soroui, Workforce and Policy Manager at the Mayor's Office of Workforce Development. Our panelists are our moderator, our very own Alan Gentle, who's the manager of the Roxbury Center for Financial Empowerment. He will moderate our star-studded panelists, Angela McCabe, Workforce Development Director, Mass Hire Boston Workforce Board, also with the Boston Private Industry Council, Amy Nishman, who's the Senior Vice President of Strategy at the Jewish Vocational Services, and Dan Knowles, co-CEO of Tech Goes Home. We thank our panelists for taking the time to share their experts' opinions and their experience with you today. A few housekeeping rules. First, I'd like to thank Justin Polk, Katie Lesner, and Peggy Watson from the Office of Workforce Development on this effort. A reminder that this session will be recorded and uploaded on our website for those who would like to access it. We'd love to hear from you, so please share your comments and questions in the chat located on the left side of your screen. And to the best of our ability, we will share all of these great thoughts from you and questions during our Q&A. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Matthew Resseger.
Hello. So thank you all for joining us today. Sort of my role here is sort of to set up, just give us a little overview of the role remote work has played sort of in Boston before the pandemic, and then how that sort of evolved during the pandemic as a way to sort of lead up to thinking about where we're headed as the recovery continues. So next slide. So I mean, before the pandemic, approximately 25% of all workers nationally occasionally worked from home, but about 15% had days that they worked exclusively from home, and only 2% worked exclusively from home, so for all 5 days for their full work week. And so, Massachusetts was always a little bit higher on that, around 5% of people sort of fully working from home. But if we can go to the next slide. I think, obviously what we've seen as we've moved into the pandemic months is quite a bit different. So this is coming from the Census Pulse survey looking from August on through March. At the national level, 37% sort of working from home, and in Massachusetts, up close to 50%, and 53% in the Boston metro area. So in that way, Boston has been similar to other sort of large, big metro areas centered on sort of professional services, tech, and finance. We have big clusters in those places like DC, San Francisco, New York. Have seen this upwards of 50% of folks working from home during the pandemic. Next slide. So consequently, we've seen sort of drastic falls in the number of people in commuting to and visiting Boston during this time period. This is data from collections of when cell phones ping. We saw sort of a fall off of about 50% of commuters falling to 60% over the course of the pandemic, and visitors, so those coming sort of outside of commuting hours and not staying the time that would be expected from commuters. So using the time patterns of travel to differentiate between the two. They're also off, between sort of 40 and 60%, depending on when you're looking during the pandemic. So go to the next slide. And showing sort of the central role that Boston plays in terms of having people coming from throughout the region as we scroll through the months here from January and February of last year into the summer months, showing just how drastic the change in terms of the role that commuters and visitors coming into the city play. We really see that visually here. And then go ahead to the next slide. And so consequently, as Boston, a center of labor markets like Boston, like some of the others we mentioned, like San Francisco and New York, have seen a more pronounced impact on their on jobs in the metro region here. Areas that are centered around sort of hubs of tech, finance, and other work that has been remote. The sort of irony of this pandemic is that places whose employment was disproportionately concentrated in remotable sectors, even though those sectors themselves saw very little job loss, those are the parts of the country that have seen the most job loss. So here we see that the country employment still down about 6%, and payroll employment in the current employment statistics down about 6% from the previous February in the country, but down closer to 10% in the Boston NECTA division. So the sort of Greater Boston, narrowest conception of Greater Boston, and that's similar for Massachusetts as well. So go to the next slide. And so, the hardest hit sectors, I think, obviously experienced by a lot of, folks, on this call, working with folks or, in leisure and hospitality sectors, it comes as no surprise that those have been the hardest hit. Down 40% in accommodation and food, down closer to 50% in arts, entertainment, and recreation. And so, I think, so next slide, and those being sort of dramatically harder hit in Boston than in the country as a whole. So I think as we think about the impact that remote work has, I think the question is what part of this is going to stick around, and what part of this is sort of something that's going to pass with hopefully the passing of the drastic health emergency that we've been in for the last year. And so, looking a little bit towards the future in job postings, we have seen in Indeed's data and research, they've seen, the number of postings mentioning remote work edging up over time. Obviously, some of those are going to be mentioning that the work is going to be remote for the near future, but not the far future. But so we are seeing some hints of this sort of moving towards the future. Next slide. And that that the job postings sort of across the gamut are you are seeing an increase in the mention of remote work, but that it's particularly concentrated in tech, finance, professional services. But you're seeing a little bit of this throughout. But the biggest impact on some of these other industries like food preparation and service, where obviously very little of the work can be done remotely, I mean, is going to come from the behavior of other people, how we all interact together in the labor market, and particularly the sort of dense, spatially concentrated labor market that is typically defined Boston. Next slide. So I think anyone who tells you they have a firm sense of where we're headed is probably, I guess I would say, exaggerating a little bit. So maybe some other people have a little bit more confidence than I do that they have their pulse on this. I mean, I think Trin spoke about some of the survey data and from the Massachusetts Business Roundtable that gives us a sense of how employers are feeling as they move into this. But I think, again, the big questions are, when the decisions of all of those employers and their employees to come together, what will sort of our new labor market equilibrium look like? I mean, I think, what we're hearing from those employers and what we're seeing in the labor, I mean, I think some shift and a pretty strong shift towards remote work is here to stay. I mean, I think the big question is, as the virus-driven impacts on employment in the service sector, I mean, I think, certainly at the countrywide level, are not, well, I mean, we could see, sort of future recurring pandemics, but I think at the countrywide level, I think, this is not a permanent phenomenon that the service sector is going to dry up. But I think the location of work is very important as we think about the future of Boston. And I mean, I think, this labor market, our labor market here has a number of strengths that I think are strong at the national level, and we would expect to see that reflect, well in terms of the near future of Boston. I mean, industries like life science and tech that have been drivers of some of the employment here, the higher education industry, and then also that Boston is a place that people enjoy, visiting, both as tourists and as people living in the area, sort of, going to our sort of business and entertainment districts, the culture and entertainment in the city, that Boston is a place that has appeal as a sort of consumer hub. So I mean, I think there are a lot of reasons to think that those are going to be things that rebound quickly and that rebound in Boston's favor. I mean, increased remote work, I mean, I think need not lead to the death of cities. And so that's where, as we see, things, survey data about how employers are making their decisions, that they're thinking of paring back space, that they're thinking of having sort of rotating employees into the office at a smaller number of desks and a smaller office footprint. I mean, I think these are big concerns for the office real estate market, which is some of what we think about at the BPDA. But I mean, I think in terms of the labor market, I mean, that's freeing up space that may be used. I mean, that may be lowering costs for other firms who hadn't thought about entering business districts in Boston due to if they thought of having their full workforce 5 days a week in the office, that amount of space wasn't going to be sort of cost effective for their business, but that in a rotating world in which they might take up a smaller office footprint, they might consider returning to our business district. And so I think I think as we look forward, rather than sort of a lot of the fear that comes around the death of cities, I mean, I think this is going to lead to uncertainty and transitions for individual businesses and sectors. But I mean, I think I think all of the types of employment that we've had in Boston, I mean, I think will return in some form. I mean, so we may think about businesses that have looked more towards business travel, maybe tacking more towards appealing to consumer travel, which may return more quickly. Obviously, there are going to be big disruptions, and big disruptions hurt sort of those who are sort of finding their way in the labor market the most. This is really challenging the jobs that I think many of the attendees on this call, working with our populations with barriers to entry. Some of those who are having a hard time finding their way in the labor market. I mean, I don't think this is going to make things easier, but I think what our panelists and I'm really excited to hear from the panelists here. I mean, about the resources and skills that residents require to navigate the changing labor market, particularly this focus on remote work. I mean, I think that's what I'm excited to be here to hear about from our panelists. And so I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic off to Sarah or perhaps back to Justin. But I look forward to hearing your questions later on in the panel as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. And that overview and macro level of remote work and what employers and employees are, how they're being mobile throughout the city using cell phone data is important, and it sheds some light on the mobility of workers. Sarah will be presenting on some of her research work that she's been doing for the last 9 to 11 months on grantees and workforce training providers, and then what other providers are responding throughout the country. And so specifically, her presentation will focus on the findings, lessons, and best practices from our grantee community right here in Boston. Sarah?
Great, can everyone see my screen and my PowerPoint?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect, all right. So good morning, everyone. So as Trin mentioned, I'm going to be presenting some information about the impact of the pandemic on the workforce development sector. And this presentation actually draws from a research effort that was led by the Office of Workforce Development. In the summer of 2020, our office, in conjunction with other Boston area workforce development funders, including SkillWorks and the United Way, sponsored a research effort to examine how our grantees were adapting their services and programs to the shutdown and the public health crisis. And really the impetus was to help funders have a better understanding of the issues that local providers were encountering with this transition to remote services in order to ensure that our funding approaches were in line with community needs and also with the operational requirements of remote or hybrid programming. So for the project, we interviewed about 16 occupational training providers in Boston, and we asked them about their experiences with the transition to remote services. The research resulted in a still unpublished report titled The Transition to Virtual Service Delivery Among Occupational Training Programs, but the report outlines key findings and recommendations for the field. But today I'll be highlighting some of the key findings from our report and particularly focusing on those findings that give us some indication about the more lasting changes that have occurred in the sector as a result of the pandemic. So before I go on, I just want to provide a little bit of a broader context on sort of the relationship between remote services and programming in the workforce development sector prior to the pandemic. So clearly these models have become more pervasive because of the public health crisis, but prior to the pandemic, distance learning and remote services were really not widespread, particularly in the community-based occupational training program, training system. And this was the case, in spite of efforts by DOL to try to promote these kinds of programs and services. They were really, DOL launched an initiative in the early 2000s to try to expand technology-based learning, distance learning in the field. Also, one of the largest, most important sort of federal policies, the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, actually emphasizes distance learning as well. But despite these sort of efforts, really remote programming in the workforce development sector was quite limited pre-pandemic. And so one example of a DOL published a study in 2015 that found that among the occupational training providers system, community-based training programs, only about 24% used blended models, and only about 1% used distance learning modalities. This is in 2015. So as you can see, it was pretty limited. So even though these models were always sort of promoted at the federal level, their diffusion has been really sort of slow, and they've been hampered by a number of different barriers, including sort of the cost and sort of the learning curve of implementing distance learning programs, as well as challenges around digital literacy and digital access. So these things have sort of continuously hampered its uptake over time. And the interviews that we conducted with the occupational training providers in Boston sort of reflected these national trends. Almost all of the organizations that we interviewed had no experience with implementing virtual services prior to the pandemic, which made, of course, the transition to remote delivery back in March much more challenging. There were, staff from these organizations described a number of challenges, including, we did hear a lot about clients' lack of digital literacy, but also staff's level of digital proficiency, and as well as home technology was one issue that actually hampered the transition for some of the organizations. We also heard about challenges with adapting their sort of in-person curriculum for distance learning, and trying to sort of think about what is a distance learning, how do you sort of think through the pedagogy of distance learning, and since most of the programs had very little experience with it before that. And so, programs faced a lot of difficulties as well with trying to get clients access to technology. So, those were some serious challenges that, for programs as they were transitioning to remote services. It is worth noting that not all of the programs we interviewed were actually able to transition. Those that had a strong sort of practicum or clinical requirement tended to suspend or sort of delay their programming. But for the most part, most of the programs that we interviewed did transition. But by the time we conducted the interviews, most of the programs had been operating virtually for several months, and they were able to share a number of benefits that they had experienced with remote services. So they described benefits for clients like, reducing clients' training-related expenditures. You can think about travel as one example, expanding the flexibility of access to their services. A lot of the organizations discussed their ability to now reach out to more challenging populations like incumbent workers, folks with caregiving responsibilities. Additionally, a number of them offered, some insights about kind of the possibilities that have emerged with remote and hybrid programming and services. So things that came up in under that sort of topic were, expanding sort of the traditional catchment area of recruitment. So some of the organizations talked about potentially, being able to sort of connect with clients in neighborhoods that they previously hadn't connected with, or even moving beyond Boston and connecting with clients outside of Boston. We also heard about, staff mentioned that some of the cost savings associated with flexible work arrangements around real estate could be potentially reinvested back to support things like client stipends or other forms of client support. And then, of course, one thing that came up a lot was the idea of connecting clients with remote jobs. And for the most part, prior to the pandemic, none of these organizations had really thought about remote job placement. So, this transition to remote services really opened that possibility up for them. And still, all of the organizations discussed significant challenges with this model, including obviously client and staff isolation, maintaining client engagement and training has been extremely difficult. And we also, programs also experienced sort of challenges with keeping certain client populations engaged. We heard that was especially the case for ESOL clients. And we also heard that, while programs did try to provide clients with technology and internet access, they really struggled with ensuring that all clients had access. Additionally, poor digital literacy was consistently implicated as being a significant challenge to operating remote programs. And I just want to make sure, is my slide deck advancing? Because I see it advancing, but I'm not quite sure if it is.
It is advancing, it's just not in full mode, but we can just move
Okay.
forward. Yep, but we can see it.
Okay, all right. But despite the barriers that digital literacy presented for the transition, almost all of our providers saw that digital skills and literacy as it being sort of a silver lining of this transition to remote services. So prior to the pandemic, most programs we interviewed hadn't actually embedded a digital literacy component or integrated a digital literacy component into their training. And interestingly, for the programs that did, the transition to remote programming was actually much less challenging and less complicated. But while since the transition to remote, almost all of the organizations that we interviewed were seeking ways to integrate digital skills and training into their regular sort of training curricula. Additionally, the transition to remote delivery also has opened up new ways of thinking about, labor market navigation skills and soft skills. For example, programs were, thinking about new modalities of professional development training, thinking about online networking, online professionalism. What does that look like? What are online soft skills for virtual collaboration? Those are the sort of new kind of electronic-based interactions and communication skills were things that they were really looking at integrating into their sort of soft skills training program. So the other thing that came out as being sort of really important is the access, digital access. So the importance of access to technology has become a critical focus for all of the programs. Prior to the pandemic, client access to technology was really not prioritized by most of the service providers that we interviewed. In general, programs typically had clients come to a physical location if they needed a computer or internet access. So if, for example, a computer lab or a library, but very few of them actually provided internet or devices to their clients prior to the pandemic. So obviously with the pandemic and the transition to remote, many of the programs were patching together funding or donations to ensure that their clients had access to the needed technology or internet. And in most cases, this was still very challenging for programs. They wanted to make sure their clients actually had tech that they could keep, but in most cases, they could only really provide loaner devices. And in addition to the actual devices, what's been more difficult than providing devices has been actually connecting clients to internet. Not all clients are eligible for the Comcast Essentials program. That leaves programs with very few options for connecting clients to internet, and usually that's meant, donating hotspots, which really hasn't been seen as a very adequate solution for the long term. So in many ways, the pandemic has sort of magnified the disparities in technology access, while sort of also underscoring the imperative of technology access and skills for the new economy. But even despite the challenges, the sector, I think, really has been kind of permanently altered by this pandemic. Most of the programs that we interviewed were planning to retain some aspects of remote or hybrid training and services. And in some cases, the pandemic actually just accelerated their plans to move in that direction. For most, though, the pandemic has really been more or less like an inflection point for rethinking about the modalities of their sort of service provision. And particularly because distance learning and remote programming was so limited prior to the pandemic, the transition has been, very revealing in terms of demonstrating to programs the critical capabilities and skills that are needed to function, for their clients to be able to function in the new economy. So with that, I'm going to, I guess, pass it back to Justin.
Thank you, Sarah. You know, your presentation that speaks directly to grantees' experiences is a really good complement to Matt's overall presentation on the labor market and what employers are thinking and how employees are moving, whether it's remote or going to work or you know, delivering food or using various modes of interaction while they're working. And now we're going to turn it over to Alan Gentle, and he's the moderator for this panel. And then we'll hear from the experts on the ground on what best practices and challenges are there for their agencies and what they've seen, and then provide some recommendations for the city and for all of us on how we should think about the future of work as we move forward. I'll turn it over to you, Alan.
Great, thank you, Trent. So I can just have all the panelists to join me at this point. I'd like to open up with this question. How do you see now that we've gotten the macro kind of a view and we've gotten some micro, how do you see the future work as we recover from this pandemic and companies seek to move towards the overall well-being of their workforce?
I can jump in there if you want, Alan.
Sure.
I'm nervous. I think that is what I'm feeling. First, let me thank Trent and OWD for having me here today. It's an honor to be on this panel, and thank you to Matt and Sarah for that incredible data. And I can just share what we're seeing. So I'm with Dan Noyes, I'm with Tech Goes Home, and we are a digital literacy nonprofit, digital equity nonprofit, trying to get computers, internet access, and those skills that everyone's talking about into the hands of people who don't have them. And something that is just tragic is that here in Massachusetts, almost 500,000 households don't have broadband. I mean, it's a massive, massive number. And when you start looking at literacy, it's worse. And not only is it worse, but it is clearly a racial justice issue. So when you look at, for example, who doesn't have digital literacy skills, it is about 23% of white workers don't have skills, 36% of Asian workers, 50% of Black workers, and 57% of Latinx workers don't have digital skills. So this is a racial justice issue. It's also an issue of education, where 41% of people who don't have a high school diploma have 0 digital skills. So what we do as an organization is try and dive in and solve some of this. So if you think about who we serve, 85% of the people we serve are BIPOC. 90% are considered very low income by HUD, or 60% are considered extreme low income. And about half of the people we serve are English language learners and immigrants. So, I mean, so the reason I'm nervous is that as this transition is happening, there is a massive number of people in the communities we all serve that are just not ready, that don't have the access. And we're seeing Band-Aids being placed. I think Sarah just mentioned the hotspots. It's not a solution. It's a temporary Band-Aid on a problem. You mentioned Internet Essentials, and like, it's a great, Comcast should get credit for doing it, but it's not fast enough. If you've got a family and that, you know, you've got multiple people trying to do things at home. Also, it's hard for people to sign up. It's not great for people who don't speak English. So it's just, there's so many barriers to getting to where I think the economy wants us to be. I hope more work is done so we don't leave an entire population of people behind.
Okay, thank you. Amy?
Sure, I can jump in. And again, thanks for having me. And the data that was presented before is really great for centering this conversation. I agree with everything that Dan said, that we see a lot of clients who are not ready. And our job as a workforce development agency is to connect clients to jobs. And how are we going to do that in the remote environment? So the first thing that we did is created something that we called the Talent Match portal that allowed clients to enter information about themselves online And then we were able to ask questions that allowed us to match clients' abilities and skills to openings and then email them information about applying for those jobs. Now, all of that's great for people with digital skills, and it's definitely a step forward and more than we were doing before in the remote environment. But again, there's a whole group of people that don't have access to a service like that. So then the next thing that we did is start a laptop lending library where we were putting technology into clients' hands who needed it so that they could participate online. So we would meet clients, hand them the technology, and in some cases also teach them how to use the technology in person safely with masks and social distancing. And then we realized that wasn't enough either, because what Dan said is also true. People don't have the digital skills that they need. So the next intervention that JVS did was to have a group of volunteers and staff members serve as what we call digital navigators. And they would sit with clients remotely and teach people through their phones how to do things like get on Zoom, mute themselves, unmute themselves, screen share, and the things that they needed to be able to participate in class. Because, and then on the side of all of that, our teachers were all doing the exact same things. They were learning the best platforms to teach different groups of students. We have students learning on Google Classroom, we have students learning on Zoom, we have students learning on WhatsApp. Like, we were doing all sorts of different things to try to meet the clients where they were at and figure it out. And then figure out which platforms could work best for that, and then replicate that across the agency. So I would say the last thing is that we had an internal teachers group to be able to share best practices so that teachers could talk to each other about what was working and what was not working and how they figured things out. So we wanted to be able to replicate the experience of small groups that you would have in an ESOL classroom. So teachers learned how to make breakout rooms and how they themselves could bounce from breakout room to breakout room. This was new for all of us. And so the teachers made a plan to be able to communicate with each other and be able to figure out how we could best serve people. And the last thing I would say is that we also realized that the digital skills they were going to need to apply for jobs were like tenfold of what the kind of information that we were doing before. People needed to learn how to apply for jobs online. People needed to learn how to interview over Zoom. None of us had ever trained people how to do that before. What's it like? How do you teach professionalism in a way that is accessible to people and showing them what it's going to be like? We used to meet clients and like physically take them to a job interview. Well, you can't do that in the remote environment. So like, how are we helping clients make sure that they could access their interviews and then get the job? And help people figure out what it was that they felt safe doing, right? So like, you can apply for jobs in the remote world, but was the job in person or online? And are you ready to be working in person? And if yes, let's talk about how you feel safe on transportation. Let's talk about how you feel safe at work and what felt right for you and your family, and help clients navigate finding a job during the health crisis.
Great. Angela, I was wondering if, as Director of Workforce Development of the Private Industry Council, what's your take on, kind of give us a macro level, given that this is the pick?
Well, I agree with Matt that a lot of this work is going to come back. I think that, you know, the tourism in Boston will come back. Our key industries in the region are healthcare and IT. They're coming back. In Boston, we've got the construction. It's the hospitality and tourism that will be shaky, and they're the entry-level jobs. They're often supplemental income for people. But I think they will come back to a level that we were previously at. The problem is in jobs that we want to train people for a career, not just a job, and that's become a problem. And when we look at our list of eligible training providers, we really didn't have the scope that we need to train people for jobs. And then when you add the level of the difficulty with training remotely, we really had to control how many vendors we could approve to move to virtual training, because we didn't have really strong examples of success rates. This has major impact on jobs that we traditionally looked at for young men, but you know, are open for everyone, and that's things like HVAC and CDL that cannot be done remotely, and not the training, not the job. So what we're finding is that for our training providers offering entry-level training, those jobs are not typically remote jobs. You go into a store, they're service industries, they're retail, they're service, they're hospitality. So it's teaching people transitional skills to be able to move over, something that maybe they can be credentialed and stackable credentialing to allow them to build up towards a career. But we're seeing a shift in what we can train for, what we will need moving forward. And then we have the other problems that came along, and Alan, I know you're, and Amy with the Financial Opportunity Centres in Boston are remotely aware that the pandemic has really hurt people. People are filing bankruptcy. Bankruptcies come up when you apply for a job and they do a background check. So people who were already behind the 8 ball are even further behind. So we have a lot of things that we have to catch up to get people back into the workforce, both new people entering the workforce and people returning after the pandemic. You know, it's not all jobs at State Street where people can work from their remote office. We really have to deal with people who are, which is the majority of our Boston residents, who are working in jobs that are local and are in person.
Mm-hmm.
And for our training providers, Dan, I hope that they're looking to partner with you because they need to have this, and not every training provider and certainly not every career center has the ability to teach digital literacy. So I really hope to see more partnerships develop after we come out of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And I can tell you, if I could just, Alan, if you don't mind me saying, we're seeing that right now, is that the demand for our programming is at a level that I can't even describe. It's just, you know, we currently work with about 150 community partners in Greater Boston, and we have a wait list of 90, to the point where we're not calling it a wait list anymore because that's disingenuous, because there's no wait. It's just, it's a forever wait list. Maybe we should call it that, but it's frustrating because these are organizations that really want to work with people, and it's really hard to do for us right now.
So let me throw in a little plug for Mass Internet Connect, which is a program through the career centers where you can apply for a laptop and for internet connection. And that models what we did with the schools, where we got the students laptops and hotspots or internet services. And EOLWD, is the Executive Office of Workforce Development at the Governor's Office, is looking to do that for unemployed people. So if you're working with a career center, you can actually get the equipment and the connectivity set up for you to take you that one step closer.
It's obviously that there's a tremendous feel for urgency, right? There's an urgent need to address these deficiencies. Well, you know, we know that women are the largest percentage of in the workforce that have been affected by the pandemic. The other group is men, particularly men of color, between the ages of 30 to about 45. Where are the opportunities to really, I mean, Dan, you mentioned digital literacy, and I could certainly agree with that, because we recently launched and just completed our first cohort of this introductory level to how to use Zoom, how, you know, some basic computer skills, some exposure to Microsoft Word. And we have, you know, I like what you said about the waiting, that there is no waiting list. We have a second cohort just waiting for a start date. How do we push this forward? You know, what channels should we be tapping? Where else should we be looking to partner?
I can jump in there. I think let's look at some of the other states. I mean, Maryland just announced a $300 million fund for digital literacy and digital equity work related to things like workforce development. I think they're using federal stimulus money to pay for it. And you're seeing this in other states. North Carolina is another place. I think that the digital divide existed long before the pandemic, but as has been said by a number of people, the pandemic shone this terrible spotlight on it and exacerbated it. I mean, the unemployment rate amongst our learners pre-COVID was about 20%. The unemployment rate amongst our learners during COVID was 42%, and it's now down to about 30%, but it's just massive unemployment. And it's not like we serve 5 people. I mean, we serve about 5,000 people a year, so it's a big chunk. But I think state leaders really need to step in. I mean, nationally is true, but here in the state, and say, listen, we have this situation where the future of work is in the digital space, and yet we have populations of people, predominantly, like you said, Alan, people of color, who don't have these skills, who don't have access, and who don't have the hardware to use it. So I think it comes down to money, right? Like people need to step up. And the other thing I'll say too is, as much as I love my ISPs. I mean, internet access is too expensive and it's too slow. And when you look at who doesn't have access, 90% of people in the state who don't have access live in urban environments. So it's all about affordability when it comes to that. So.
Absolutely. And Amy, you and I both, JVS has a FOC, Financial Opportunity Center, pretty much like I do that I manage here. When we look at our clients who are really getting further and further into debt, as Angela just mentioned, what do you see from your lens and the FOC, and how you're addressing those challenges?
I think it's everything that the panel has already said today. Like, I agree that government really has a role to step in and make sure that people have access to the technology and the internet access that they need to be able to move forward, because only then, and partnership, sure, like we have a partnership with Text Goes Home, and at our Career Center also operates the program that Angela mentioned, but that's only going to go so far. And really what you need is massive access to be able to help people move through the employment situation that we're in right now. So after you have solved for getting technology into people's hands, then you need to solve for internet, then you need to solve for digital skills. So that's already 3 things. And after we've done all of that, then we need to solve for their barriers to work, which are all the things that have always been there, just like the digital literacy piece has always been there. And then we need to help clients through that. That's a whole lot of steps to be able to help people get a job.
Absolutely.
And if I could just add to that, I think Alan and Amy, you mentioned too, there's this misconception that everyone knows how to use the internet, or that everyone has a computer, or everyone has internet. And I think that's changed a bit because of the pandemic. But I think Amy was talking earlier about, and Alan, you just mentioned some of the very basic things. There's a whole lot of people who have never filled out an online form at all. So, for example, Career Builder put out this study and said that 60% of people that fill out a form on their website don't complete it because they found it too difficult. And it's just, I think, there are people that don't know what Google is. There are people that don't have email. If you don't have an email address, how are you supposed to apply for a job these days? So I think it's these very basic steps. And even if it's an in-person job, like if you want a job at Walmart, you don't go into Walmart to fill out an application. You go on Walmart's website, or McDonald's, or whatever it is. So I think we need to really focus on these basic skills and not ignore populations because it's difficult. And I think that's one of the issues too, is that there's no silver bullet to this. I mean, I love what I do and I'm really proud of what we do, but we can't do it alone. And there's so many other things that need to be done as well.
Okay. What I would like right now is to turn it over and let's figure out if there are any questions from the audience. Justin?
No questions as of yet.
No questions as of yet. Okay, well, great. Well, that means sounds like we're kind of touching all those hot button issues and responding to those that people would otherwise be asking about. I just want to turn a little bit more again to credit, right? And we know that credit is becoming one of the barriers to entry into work. And we see that from our standpoint, where a lot of our clients are, because they're indebted, they're having a difficult time breaking through. So I just want to ask this generally then, where do we see the role of employers, in that space to helping clients to navigate that?
I have to say, Alan, I have been really surprised at how engaged employees have been over this period. As you know, on JVS, many of the agencies work closely with our hospitals. They've been really responsive. They have, taken another look at their job descriptions. They're talking to us. They hosted a job fair for people who are re-entering from the correctional systems. Employers are trying to get employees. I look at the career centers, they're serving about 50% of the customers they would typically have served, but now they're still maintaining about an 80 to 90% employer services rate. People, there are jobs out there, employers are trying to get them, and employers are willing to work with us. You know, so when we look at taking people out of hospitality and put them into a healthcare setting, the employers are our partner in this. You know, we can do the training, we can get people into the job, and then the employer picks it up with incumbent worker training through either their own funds. For other employers, they use the workforce training fund. So there are ways to work with our employers to try to open those doors. But the background checks, all of those, we have to revisit those after this period. It's too difficult to get someone into a job if we're not looking at the circumstances after this year.
Yes, absolutely.
I'll just add too, it's hard to get internet. Like, you know, you mentioned Internet Essentials, which is Comcast low-income plan, but if you have debt with them, it's really hard to get it. And if I could just add one thing on top of that, is we find, at least amongst our learners, is a good chunk of them are unbanked, like that they don't use traditional banking. And there's all these studies that show that, like, if you have a checking account, you pay something like $37 a year in fees. But if you have zero and use check cashing stores, you pay like $435 a year in fees. So it's just like the cycle is that it's impossible to get people out of, or it's hard to get people out, not impossible.
And these are issues that we had before the pandemic. So let's not forget that we had many of these issues and didn't address them. You know, this shines a light on it. And to be honest, with the Biden administration putting up money that will come to the states, there are opportunities now for us to start to address some of these, maybe one-time, big-time things. You know, the pandemic came, it's gutted our economy. We need a pandemic-sized response to address this. We need massive investment. I know we all are shaking our heads and agreeing to it, but we have to advocate for this because the money will come from the administration. We have to be smart in how we use it.
Absolutely.
We need to make those linkages to the industries that are growing, the life sciences, the IT, but we also have to take care of our people who cannot walk into one of those jobs. And we have to look at our training providers, our community colleges, to answer those questions.
And incidentally, I just want to take the opportunity actually just to share with you, if you haven't heard already, the Office of Financial Empowerment. We have a program actually that continues to grow, Bank on Boston, and it's actually a program that provides access to the individuals, access to banking accounts that are very low or no fee at all. Michael Handelman is our program manager for that program, and I would definitely encourage you to reach out to him. We have these banks, institutions who are part of the Bank on Boston initiative. It's actually a program now, certified to provide these type of accounts. For instance, Bank of America has an account called Advantage Safe Balance Banking. All it requires is a minimum deposit of $25. It has a monthly maintenance fee of about $5, no overdraft fees, non-sufficient fund fee, and then we have U.S. Alliance that does not even require a minimum balance to open an account. So it's another way for us to further enhance, the access to the use of these financial institutions to our constituent customers as well.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you, Angela, and Dan chiming in on the credit piece and the banking piece as it ties to, access to technology. You're absolutely right. It's part of, applying for a job, digital skills, but then everything else is going remote at the same time. So banking is definitely an integral part of the digital divide. We do have a question in the chat that I'd like to ask as well, and it's from Salvador Pina. Thank you for submitting your question. Salvador asked, how has challenges with limited English speaking ability impacted your strategies for advancing digital literacy? I know all of you have experience with working with customers and residents who speak in language other than English. So any one of you can chime in.
I can go first. Hi, Sal. Thanks for your question. JVS serves a lot of immigrant learners, and the majority of our clients speak in language other than English. I would say the first strategy that we used is meeting clients on the technology that we knew that they were already comfortable on. So WhatsApp, for example, is an app that many of our clients already knew. So we started there and like reached out to them and said, are you still interested in coming to class? This is how we're doing class. Class still can happen online. And then many times walking students through on an individual basis how to log into Zoom and things like that. And in some cases, holding class on WhatsApp, you know, in group chats and things like that, so that we would be able to get them engaged and then teach them how to go forward. And then the idea of having a digital navigator, which is someone, a volunteer, who can then sit one-on-one with a student and walk them through. And we have navigators who speak multiple languages. And then sometimes clients would find translators to sit with them while they learned the technology through the digital navigator.
For us, we have a bilingual staff that we provide financial coaching and employment coaching as well in Spanish and English, and a very nice platform of workshops that focus on actually improving their financial employment skill sets.
I would add, I mean, I 1000% agree with everything Amy just said. I mean, just from we run our program, I think it's in 9 languages at the moment, with English, Spanish, and Haitian Creole being the top 3. I think translation of materials is huge. And along with that, being very careful with reading level of what you're presenting is also really important. And then advocating. I think that's a big piece of this too, is that oftentimes, just my experience has been that immigrant populations are ignored, and you know, it's up to organizations like all of ours to stand up and say, no, we're not going to ignore this population simply because you know, it's hard to reach. So I think advocacy is a big piece of that.
And working with the employer. Many employers will offer on-site English classes if we could get people to a very basic level. And there are some great examples out there of employers who have used the Workforce Training Fund or have contracted privately with a training provider to teach ESL. So we shouldn't be afraid to push back on employers to ask them to participate in this sort of staff development, onboarding piece to their careers.
Thank you, Angela. And actually, that is a great point that Gabrielle Gitti have asked in the chat. And Gabrielle asked, have we seen employers making strides to make their systems and work cultures more accessible, equitable, and inclusive to the communities being served? And it goes back, that question, Gabrielle, is great because, you know, it goes back to what all of our panelists have talked about, which is, you know, meeting employees and customers and residents where they are, but then how are employers reaching out to the diverse constituents as well and meeting them where they are? Anyone want to take that question?
I can start. We've definitely talked to employers at JVS who we've been able to say to them, so one employer I talked to wanted the first week of work to be in-person training, and then the rest of the job was remote. And I really pushed them on like why you were having people come in when we needed them to be able to use the technology, and they ended up changing it. So then it was a fully remote job, and then that was more accessible to people who were not able or willing to come to work in person. On the flip side of that, we've had conversations with employers who have expected a high level of English for a position where we're able to say to them, can we really think about the English language skills that you need to be in this position? And would you be willing to work with us and hire people maybe who have a lower English skill than you're expecting, if we can do the job training with them to help them understand what it is that they'll need to be able to do in the position? And employers are open to those conversations right now because they need good talent, and we have good talent who have had barriers to the labor market that can be overcome both through job training and through conversations with employers.
Yeah, I agree. We've seen a lot of the hospitals in particular coming to the table to ask how can we work with them better. We're currently trying to recruit for PCTs at the hospital, which was previously a minimum wage job, is now worth $19 an hour. We've seen the value of PCTs, CNAs, and any of those roles at hospitals over the pandemic. So to be able to look at people who were originally thinking of maybe doing a culinary degree, thinking of, or not degree, but a training, wanting to go into something like this where they have stability and upward growth within something like a hospital or a hospital consortium. And I think for an agency like JVS, who's so big and can deal with a lot of employers, that's wonderful. The smaller ones rely on consortiums and groups of employers coming together to spread that wealth a little bit. And we've tried to do it with both IT and healthcare at the Workforce Board, and other workforce boards are doing the same. So I think bringing employers to the table at the beginning and saying, not just what is your need, but how are you going to help us to get that supply to you? I mean, what is your part in this?
That's great. I'm sorry.
I was just going to give a quick shout out. There's an organization called Resseger.
Absolutely.
That does incredible work, exactly what Angela was just talking about, where they take students who are not college graduates and basically turn them into development/coding groups. And I'm going to mess this stat up, but it's something like 90+% of their graduates end up with an income of like $90,000 a year. Something, it's like got nines in it. But
was that resilient coders? Yeah.
Resilient coders, yeah. And I just think that's an example, like we were talking earlier, of what needs to happen. It's like we need 15 of them, and not just in development/coding. It should be in other industries as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. And the other question is for Matt Resseger. Matt, you had presented data around the future of work, and you mentioned in your presentation that labor economists can provide some projections, but not anything concrete in terms of exactly what types of positions and what percentage of jobs will be fully remote, will be hybrid, and then would be actually in person fully. Can you talk about, how that impacts the ecosystem of other businesses and employers if large employers decided a hybrid approach? So for example, you have like the State Streets here in Boston, Fidelity, and or, other large employers who are anchor employers. And if they were going remote, how would that impact smaller businesses like dry cleaners, and then catering services and food and the supply chain that impacts the labor market for the ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we've seen some of the impacts of kind of the worst case scenario there over the last year in terms of, companies not having their employees come into downtown business districts, and that really, devastating those areas, much more so than other parts of, sort of more neighborhood business districts that have had sort of resilient demand, even in the face of the pandemic. So, I mean, I think, if the scenario did come to pass where, all of the anchor institutions sort of, kept everyone fully remote forever, I think that would, have, very negative impacts on the support industries. I think so that, that is, a vital sort of step of reopening is having sort of a, some coordination in returning to downtown. And before we see that, I think it is going to be, a hard time for the districts that have sprung up around employer, around, downtown office demand. I think are going to be struggling until we see a robust return to downtown. I think I mean, I think, the likelihood of the sort of worst case scenario coming to pass there, I mean, I think even as we see employer surveys that say we're moving more towards a hybrid model, I mean, that's still a hybrid model in which they're going to be bringing, a large number of their workers downtown on each given, day, and that a lot of the things, if you're only going to downtown 2 days a week, you used to bring your lunch 3 days and eat at restaurants 2 days or something. It's not clear that people will scale back their consumption in business districts in ratio to how much they're. I mean, it may be that people, I mean, a lot of downtown business districts are about sort of after work activities and the fact that people have been brought to the area and are now there. I mean, it's not like you go out to dinner every day that you go to work. So, I mean, I think, so I mean, it's an opportunity to take advantage of what Boston has to offer. And so I think the more pessimistic scenarios about, I mean, first of all, I think don't necessarily take into account that, I mean, I think, I don't think right now it doesn't appear that we're going to sort of like lose anchors, though obviously the world changes over time. And I mean, we haven't had anchors announcing they're leaving Boston or something like that. And so, I mean, I think we're talking about sort of, fractions of time and fractions of employers. And I think we also need to be thinking on the side of what other employers are going to be coming in. Are we going to see growth in again, like I mentioned, sort of smaller employers that haven't necessarily found it cost effective to have a downtown presence, but may now at a smaller scale? Are we going to see, sort of more development in some of the industries that people are talking a lot about, like, science, lab space kinds of issues that where we are going to see, continued development and continued growth and employment that, I mean, I think as we sort of see this start to shake out, I mean, I think some of the most pessimistic visions about what this could mean for the sort of devastation of downtown employment are likely not to be what we see. But I think it's hard to see that from now when we are kind of looking at really severe employment losses in downtown, a lot of people having lost jobs, a lot of businesses having not been able to make it. I mean, I think this is a time of real pessimism, and I think it's hard to see how this is going to move towards something that looks more normal. But I do think there are a lot of reasons to think that there will be a pick back up in services in demand for sort of the services that have served downtown. But I mean, there may be some spread. I mean, again, I highlighted that some of the Main Street business districts around the city, I mean, have seen actually some sort of resilient demand and demand coming from more people being sort of in their neighborhood in the evening. And so, I mean, I think we have questions, about exactly where, will there be any decentralization of service employment and how will we sort of move towards that? I mean, I think, those are still active questions that I think we're trying to get our minds around.
Thank you, Matthew. We have two more questions in the chat. One is from Kathy Hamilton. What is being done to plan for what kind of new training programs we might stand up with the upcoming stimulus bill? And so I take that question to be, stimulus funds are coming down the pipeline, and if we are able to get funding for workforce training, are there any new programs, or how are we thinking about using those stimulus dollars? We welcome them. I haven't seen them yet, but we welcome them. But I'm going to actually hand it over to the panelists because they're the experts who we shepherd the funds to, and they're on the ground. So I'd give them that question. How would you use training dollar funding from the stimulus to enhance your work now? And what would you do differently with those funding?
Oh, Trent, asking someone who runs a nonprofit what they could do with more money. Like, It's like a dream question.
I had to ask, Dan, wishful thinking, but you know what? That's our job. We try to shepherd as much money as we can to the ground as fast as possible.
I will say that obviously this is a conversation that we've been having internally and externally with our partners, and the intel we have is that it's, talking to the governor and talking to mayors is going to be huge because there's so much leeway with this funding, and but for us it's scale. It's scale. Is that just that we want to grow and serve more people, and I think that we want to serve them better. So doing things with our programming to make it more customized to people's needs makes it more expensive for us. But that's the best way to do it. So in terms of what's new, I think that would be something that it would be a dream to do. But the big thing is just scale, is just trying to get to as many people as we possibly can.
I'll go, since 90% of my relationship with Trin is asking her for more money for job training. And so, I mean, good job training, two things. One is I would scale what we know already works. So things that have been mentioned today and other programs that are really effective at moving people into the economy, I would make them bigger. And then the second thing I would do is what any good job training provider does. You look at the labor market, figure out what the jobs are, figure out what the barriers to those jobs are, and see how far you could move people to get them into the entry-level positions or middle skill positions that are going to lead them toward sustainable. So what are the jobs? What are the career pathways to those jobs? And then what are the skills that you need to do those jobs? And can you build something that will move people into them quickly? Angela?
Again, I think we need to take a hard look at the economy and decide on these growing industries, what can we do? All those jobs seem so far out of our reach and they're not. We've done programs with life science before. We've done programs with IT before. We need to be able to get an understanding of what are the employers going to need and how do we train to that. We also have to look at increasing the skills training, to Amy's point, because we have so few vouchers in the city. It's really hard to look at anything on scale without private philanthropy. And Trin, my understanding is that you have a friend in Washington that you can help influence. But working with the employers, I believe, I think really that's the piece to this, and bringing the community colleges and the colleges to the table in the professional development areas. I know Sal Peanut's on the call. But to start thinking of stackable credentialing, that people can take something simple to get into a job and then carry it forward. And I think we have to look at funding that carries with the person. It can't just be a one-off, one voucher and a go. I think there has to be some, I hate to use the term lifelong learning, but there has to be some sort of benefit that goes with that someone can carry through. We do it for people who lose their jobs through trade. I think we have to look at it for all dislocated workers, that you have multiple years to use a funding source. You can get a second step on that ladder before we let you go. I don't think the one and done is working for us.
And then I just want to add then that we know that it's almost like if we could get this like tomorrow, the delivery services, for instance, UPS, and all those, they are, in tremendous need of drivers with CDL licenses, and those credentials cost money. It costs anywhere from $7,000 to $8,000 to get one trained and licensed with a CDL. So I just want to add that piece to it.
Great, thank you. I'm sorry, go ahead, Angela.
I was going to say, Alan, if we could increase the pool of training providers who will do the training, we can certainly pay for them.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's not just like training providers as well, but it's case managers, job developers, career specialists, career coaching as well. So, we're working with a community who have talent, but also have many economic barriers that need to be addressed. And it's our job to make sure that it's not just about the training, but what kind of other supportive services can we connect them to? And that's leveraging the ecosystem of the city, our partners, our educational institutions as well. There is one last question, but it's on the American jobs piece, and that requires a whole webinar itself. So Aaron Tavares asked that question on the American Jobs Plan, and unfortunately we're out of time, and that's something that we should have a webinar on as soon as it comes down the pipeline. I want to just close by thanking all of our panelists. You know, Matt and Sarah gave us insights on their work. They've been having a pulse on this, on the labor market, employers, and then Sarah's work on our grantees to ensure that we're listening and we're on the ground to make sure that we're getting as many resources and support as much as possible out there. So thank you, Matthew and Sarah, for that work. Dan, Amy, Alan, and Angela are workforce practitioners and also people who are on the ground who are really advocating for what works, what needs to be scaled, and what the city and state and the feds need to do. So thank you for helping us be accountable and for informing us on what works, because at the end of the day, I think a panelist said this, Dan said this, that we can't do this by ourselves. And so we need a whole team from different disciplines and areas to make this work and address some of the insurmountable challenges that our community and neighborhoods are facing. So I want to thank all of you for your time and your expertise and your thought and sharing with us. I want to thank Justin Polk again, who has been our IT coordinator and manager to do this work. It's not easy. And I especially want to thank the attendees who've taken the time to learn and share their thoughts. This is just the first step in learning about you know, the changes going on in the community. So we will have more panels, discussions, and studies out. So stay tuned for our next panel discussion, which is on May the 19th. Sponsored by our Office of Financial Empowerment with the Boston Feds on racial equity and wealth building as the economy recovers. So a lot of good stuff coming out of our office. Stay tuned. Thanks again for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thank you.